in the shadow of Seattle's neon-lit streets, where the hum of the city fades into the damp, whispering woods, a predator stalked his prey for nearly 2 decades. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway, a man so unremarkable in appearance that he blended into the gray drizzle of the Pacific Northwest like a ghost. To those who knew him, a quiet truck painter, a churchgoer, a father, a husband, he was just another face in the crowd, a man who mowed his lawn, read his Bible, and smiled at his neighbors. But beneath that mundane exterior lurked a darkness so vile it would etch his name into the annals of American horror as the Green River Killer, the most prolific serial murderer in the nation's history. Between 1982 and 1998, Ridgway claimed the lives of at least 49 women, though he boasted of many more. His victims' bodies discarded like refuse along the muddied banks of the Green River. His targets were society's forgotten, sex workers, runaways, young women whose absence, he believed, would go unnoticed. This is the story of a man who turned his twisted desires into a gruesome career, a city gripped by fear, and the chilling motives that drove a monster to kill again and again. Born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Gary Ridgway was the second of 3 sons to Mary and Thomas Ridgway. The family moved to a poverty-stricken neighborhood near Seattle's Pacific Highway when Gary was young, a place where the roar of airplanes from the nearby SeaTac airport drowned out the cries of those who lived on the margins. Ridgway's childhood was a crucible of dysfunction, forged in the heat of violent arguments between his domineering mother and passive father. Relatives whispered of a home where tension simmered, where young Gary witnessed his mother's rage and absorbed her control. But it was a specific, unsettling ritual that would haunt his psyche. His mother's habit of washing his genitals well into his adolescence, a humiliating act that stirred a toxic brew of arousal, shame, and fury. Forensic psychologist Reed Malloy, who studied Ridgway's case, described this as a spark for displaced matricide, an unconscious need to kill his mother over and over through his victims. For an adolescent, having your mother wash your genitals would be highly exciting and arousing, but it would also be humiliating, Malloy noted. With humiliation would come rage. This rage found its outlet in the women Ridgway targeted, women he saw as extensions of that primal anger. Sex workers, runaways, and vulnerable girls along Seattle's Pacific Highway South, known as the SeaTac Strip, became his prey. To Ridgway, they were disposable, their lives worth less in a society that often overlooked them. He hated them, he later confessed, believing their disappearances would draw little attention. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught, he told investigators, his voice chillingly matter-of-fact. His choice was calculated, born from a twisted logic that their transient lives and societal stigma would shield him from scrutiny. These women, often as young as 15, were not just victims of his violence, but pawns in a game of control, where he could exert the power he felt denied in his own life. Ridgway's methods were as methodical as they were monstrous. He was a predator who wore a mask of normalcy, charming his victims with small talk, flashing photos of his son to gain their trust, or offering a ride in his beat-up pickup truck. But behind the smile was a man who saw murder as his career, a word he used with pride when confessing to police. "Choking is what I did, and I was pretty good at it," he boasted, his words dripping with a cold arrogance that sent shivers through even the most seasoned detectives. His obsession with deviant sex, rooted in a lifetime of suppressed desires and violent fantasies, fueled his killing spree. Ridgway's time in the U.S. Navy, where he frequented prostitutes in Vietnam and contracted a sexually transmitted disease, only deepened his resentment toward women in the sex trade. Retired FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, who interviewed Ridgway, described his urges as exciting and sexually arousing, a compulsion to prey, kidnap, and kill that he felt entitled to indulge. The Seattle of the 1980s and 1990s was a city of contrasts, a booming tech hub where skyscrapers cast long shadows over the gritty underbelly of the SeaTac Strip. Along Route 99, sex workers plied their trade under flickering streetlights, their lives precarious in a world that judged them harshly. It was here, in this forgotten corridor, that Ridgway hunted, blending into the night like a specter, the Green River a sluggish, muddy waterway winding through King County, became his dumping ground, its banks a silent graveyard for the women he killed. The river's name would become synonymous with terror, a haunting reminder of the bodies it carried and the killer who eluded capture for so long. As the body count rose, fear seeped into the community, a creeping dread that no one was safe. Women vanished from the streets, their fates unknown, while families waited in agony for news that might never come. Ridgway's psychological motives were a labyrinth of depravity. His low IQ, tested in the low 80s, belied a cunning that allowed him to evade detection for nearly 2 decades. He was disciplined, obsessive, and terrifyingly patient, never speaking of his crimes to anyone, not his wives, not his son, not his co-workers at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he painted trucks for 30 years. His third wife, Judith Mawson, described their 17 years together as a newlywed bliss, oblivious to the monster she shared a bed with. Yet Ridgway's mind was a cauldron of contradiction. A religious fanatic who went door to door preaching scripture, he was also a man who returned to his victims' bodies to commit necrophilia, a grotesque ritual that satisfied his need for control even after death. "I like to drive by the clusters around the county and think about the women I placed there," he later admitted, his voice a chilling echo of a man who saw his victims as trophies in a macabre collection. What drove Gary Ridgway to such depths of evil? Psychologists point to a perfect storm of factors: a troubled childhood, a domineering mother, and a sexual obsession that twisted into violence. His hatred for sex workers was not just personal but societal, a reflection of a culture that devalued their lives, making them easy targets for his rage. Posts on X have noted how serial killers like Ridgway, Jack the Ripper, and Peter Sutcliffe targeted prostitutes because they knew police often dismissed their disappearances, a grim reality that Ridgway exploited. He saw himself as above the law, a man entitled to take what he wanted without consequence, a belief that fueled his relentless killing spree. To him, each murder was a release, a way to exorcise the demons of his past while asserting a godlike power over life and death. As the 1980s dawned, Seattle was unprepared for the nightmare that was unfolding. The Green River would soon become a name whispered in fear, a symbol of the unseen terror that lurked in the city's shadows. Ridgway, the unassuming truck painter, was no longer just a man. He was a phantom, a killer who walked among his neighbors, his secrets buried in the dark earth of King County. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would haunt the Pacific Northwest, a chilling saga of death, deception, and a city's desperate hunt for a monster. The summer of 1982 hung heavy over Seattle, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked pine and the distant hum of the SeaTac Strip's neon lights. Along the Pacific Highway South, where the city's pulse beat raw and unfiltered, young women vanished into the night, their laughter swallowed by the shadows. The Green River, a sluggish serpent of murky water winding through King County, became a silent witness to a nightmare that would grip the Pacific Northwest in a chokehold of fear. Gary Ridgway, the unassuming truck painter with a smile as bland as his suburban life, was no longer just a man. He was a phantom, a predator whose hands dripped with the blood of dozens. His victims, mostly sex workers and runaways, were discarded like broken dolls along the river's banks, their bodies a grim testament to a killer who thrived on control and secrecy. This is the story of a city under siege, a river stained with death, and a killer whose methodical savagery pushed Seattle to the brink. The first body surfaced on July 15, 1982, a chilling discovery that shattered the illusion of safety. Wendy Lee Caulfield, just 16, was found floating in the Green River, her nude body snagged on a piling near Kent, Washington. Her neck bore the cruel marks of strangulation, her eyes frozen in a final plea. The police, initially dismissive, chalked it up to the dangers of the street life. But then, on August 12th, another body emerged from the river's depths. Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23, another sex worker, her lifeless form tangled in debris. The pattern was undeniable, and panic began to simmer. 3 days later, on August 15th, a slaughterhouse worker waiting near the river stumbled upon a gruesome tableau. 3 more bodies: Marcia Faye Chapman, 31, Cynthia Jean Hines, 17, and Opal Charmaine Mills, 16, strewn like discarded relics, their skin pale against the muddy banks. The Green River had become a graveyard, and Seattle's heart skipped a beat. The body count climbed with terrifying speed, each discovery more horrifying than the last. Ridgway's victims were young, vulnerable, and often desperate. Girls like Gail Lynn Matthews, 23, who dreamed of escaping the streets, or Deborah Estes, just 15, whose bright smile masked a life of hardship. He lured them with promises of money, a warm ride in his pickup truck, or a flash of his son's photo to feign humanity. But once they were alone, the mask fell. Ridgway's hands, calloused from years at the Kenworth truck factory, became instruments of death, choking the life from his victims with a precision he later bragged about. "I was good at it," he would say, his voice a cold blade slicing through the air. He killed in his home, in his truck, or in secluded wooded areas, each murder a ritual of dominance that fed his twisted desires. Some victims, he confessed, were strangled during sex, their final moments a grotesque blend of violation and violence. The Green River's banks became Ridgway's canvas, a place to display his macabre art. He dumped bodies in clusters, often returning to defile them in acts of necrophilia that spoke to a mind unhinged by obsession. "I like to drive by and think about them," he later told detectives, his words dripping with a perverse nostalgia that made even hardened investigators recoil. The river wasn't his only dumping ground. Bodies surfaced in wooded areas, near highways, even under piles of garbage at the SeaTac airport. Ridgway was meticulous, stripping his victims of jewelry and clothes to erase their identities, scattering their remains across King County like ashes in the wind. Some, like 17-year-old Kimmy Pitzer, were left in shallow graves, their bones unearthed years later by animals or rain. Others, like 18-year-old Marie Malvar, vanished without a trace, their fates a haunting question mark. As the 1980s wore on, Seattle was a city under a dark spell. The SeaTac Strip, once a gritty but lively corridor, became a ghost town of fear. Sex workers whispered warnings to each other, their eyes scanning for the man in the pickup truck who seemed too kind, too ordinary. Families of the missing, mothers like Linda Rule, whose daughter Carol in Christensen was found with a paper bag over her head, clung to fading hope, their lives fractured by grief. By 1984, the official victim count reached 26, but police suspected dozens more. The Green River Task Force, formed in 1982, was overwhelmed, their resources stretched thin as bodies kept appearing. The media dubbed the killer the Green River Killer, a name that hung like a curse over the city, fueling nightmares and headlines. Posts on X later reflected the terror of the era, with users recalling how no one felt safe walking alone, and how the river became a place you avoided after dark. Ridgway's killing spree was a masterclass in methodical horror. He operated with a chilling rhythm, sometimes killing multiple women in a single day, his appetite insatiable. His third wife, Judith Mawson, remained blissfully unaware, describing their life together as like newlyweds, while Ridgway slipped away into the night to hunt. He was a chameleon, blending into his blue-collar life, painting trucks, attending church, raising his son, while his secret life pulsed with violence. He memorized the terrain of King County, choosing dumping sites with care. The Green River's secluded banks, the dense forests near Enumclaw, the abandoned lots near the airport. He knew the river's currents, the way the water could hide his sins, and he exploited it with a predator's cunning. "I wanted to kill as many as I could," he later confessed, his words a chilling echo of a man who saw murder as his calling. The tension in Seattle reached a fever pitch by the mid-1980s. Each new body was a gut punch, a reminder that the killer was still out there, taunting the city with his invisibility. The Green River Task Force, led by Detective Dave Reichert, chased leads with desperate fervor, but the killer seemed to dance just out of reach. Ridgway's victims were often unidentified for months, their bones weathered by time and the elements, their stories reduced to case files in a growing stack. The police interviewed sex workers, combed riverbanks, and followed tips that led nowhere, but the killer's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. Women like 20-year-old Roberta Joseph Hayes, found in a field near Highway 410, or 16-year-old Kelly K. McGinnis, whose remains were scattered in the woods, became symbols of a city's failure to protect its most vulnerable. Yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of eerie calm. Ridgway would pause his killing sprees, sometimes for months, lulling the city into a false sense of security. These lulls were strategic, a predator's patience that allowed him to blend back into his ordinary life. He'd kiss his wife goodnight, mow his lawn, and preach scripture at his church, all while the bodies of his victims decayed in the wilderness. The climax of each killing cycle was a burst of violence, a frenzy where he'd claim multiple lives in a single night, only to retreat into silence. This pattern kept Seattle on edge, the city holding its breath, waiting for the next body to surface. When 18-year-old Marta Reeves was found in 1990, years after her disappearance, it was a stark reminder. The Green River Killer was not done. The resolution of each grim discovery brought no relief, only more questions. The police began to suspect a serial killer early on, but the sheer scale of the murders was staggering. By 1987, the victim count was officially at 40, though Ridgway later claimed he killed 70 or more. The Green River became a symbol of terror, its name whispered in bars and homes, a place where children no longer played and fishermen avoided its banks. The task force's frustration grew as leads dried up, and the killer's ability to evade capture seemed almost supernatural. Yet, in the quiet moments, as the city mourned its lost daughters, a faint spark of determination flickered. The police vowed to catch him, no matter how long it took, unaware that the key to his capture lay in a science still in its infancy: DNA. The Green River Killer's reign was a slow-burning horror, a crescendo of death that left Seattle reeling. Each body was a chapter in a story no one wanted to read, each victim a name etched into the city's collective memory. Ridgway's methodical precision, his ability to kill and vanish, made him a ghost in plain sight, a man who walked among his neighbors while hiding a darkness that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The stage was set for a desperate pursuit, a battle between a relentless task force and a killer who seemed untouchable. In the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, where the glow of streetlights flickered like dying stars, a war was being waged in the shadows. By the mid-1980s, the Green River Killer had turned King County into a hunting ground, his victims' bodies piling up along the murky banks of the Green River like offerings to a dark god. The city was gripped by a feverish dread, its pulse quickening with every new headline, every whispered rumor of another girl gone missing. The Green River Task Force, a band of determined detectives led by the steely-eyed Dave Reichert, was Seattle's last line of defense against a phantom who seemed to vanish into the mist. Their pursuit was a high-stakes dance of desperation and obsession, chasing a killer who was always one step ahead. Gary Ridgway, the unassuming truck painter with a smile as dull as dishwater, was no ordinary prey. He was a chameleon, a predator whose ordinariness was his greatest weapon. This is the story of a task force pushed to the brink, a killer who slipped through their fingers, and a game of cat and mouse that left Seattle trembling. The Green River Task Force was born in the wake of the 1982 discoveries, when the river's grim harvest of bodies, Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, and others, could no longer be ignored. By 1984, with the body count climbing past 26, the task force was a hive of frenetic energy, its headquarters a maze of case files, maps, and grainy photos of missing girls. Detective Reichert, a devout Christian with a fire in his gut, became the face of the hunt, his nights haunted by the faces of the dead. The task force combed the SeaTac Strip, interviewing sex workers, who spoke in hushed tones of a man in a pickup truck, his demeanor too calm, his eyes too cold. They scoured the riverbanks, their boots sinking into the mud where bodies lay hidden, and chased tips that led to dead ends. The killer was a ghost, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, only the silent screams of his victims echoing in the wind. Ridgway's name first surfaced in 1983, a faint blip on the radar that would haunt investigators for years. On April 30th, 18-year-old Marie Malvar vanished after climbing into a dark pickup truck on the SeaTac Strip. Her boyfriend, Robert Woods, followed the truck to a quiet street in Des Moines, Washington, where he saw it parked outside a modest house. The address belonged to Gary Ridgway. Woods reported it to police, who questioned Ridgway, but his demeanor was disarming, soft-spoken, cooperative, a family man who seemed incapable of such horrors. "Just a misunderstanding," he said, claiming Marie had left after a brief encounter. Without evidence, the police let him go, unaware they'd just shaken hands with the devil himself. Posts on X years later reflected the frustration of the era, with users noting how cops had Ridgway in their sights early, but couldn't pin him down, a sentiment that underscored the killer's slippery genius. The task force's efforts intensified, their pursuit a pulse-pounding race against time. They deployed helicopters to scan the river's bends, divers to plumb its depths, and cadaver dogs to sniff out the dead in King County's dense forests. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, from Johns to drifters, but Ridgway's ordinariness was a shield. He was a fixture at the Kenworth truck factory, clocking in for 30 years, his hands stained with paint, not blood. His neighbors saw a devout man who read scripture and mowed his lawn with precision. His third wife, Judith Mawson, saw a loving husband who brought her flowers, oblivious to the monster who slipped out at night to kill. Ridgway's ability to compartmentalize was chilling. He'd strangle a woman in the woods, then come home to tuck his son into bed, his face a mask of suburban calm. The tension reached a crescendo in 1987 when Ridgway became a prime suspect. A search of his home revealed nothing, no murder weapons, no trophies, just a tidy house and a man who seemed baffled by the attention. He passed a polygraph test, his voice steady, his lies polished by years of practice. "I'm not your guy," he told detectives, his eyes glinting with a secret only he knew. The task force was stumped. They had fibers, semen samples, and paint chips from crime scenes, but forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA analysis, a fledgling technology, wasn't yet reliable enough to crack the case. Ridgway knew this, and he played the game with a predator's patience, pausing his killings during intense police scrutiny, only to resume when the heat died down. "I'd wait, let things cool off," he later confessed, his words a chilling reminder of his control. The city's fear was palpable, a seductive undercurrent that kept Seattle on edge. Sex workers on the SeaTac Strip worked in pairs, their eyes darting to every passing truck, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that any John could be the killer. Families of the missing, like those of 16-year-old Kelly Kay McGinnis or 20-year-old Roberta Joseph Hayes, held vigils, their hope fading with each passing year. The media fueled the frenzy, with headlines screaming, "Green River Killer strikes again," and sketches of a faceless monster plastered across newspapers. The task force faced mounting pressure, their budget ballooning to millions as the body count climbed. By 1988, the official tally was 42, but Ridgway later claimed he'd killed 70 or more, a boast that sent shivers through investigators. Each new discovery, like the bones of 17-year-old Cindy Smith, found near Highway 18, was a gut punch, a reminder that the killer was still out there, laughing in the dark. Ridgway's evasion was a masterclass in deception. He was meticulous, stripping his victims of jewelry and clothes to thwart identification, dumping bodies in clusters to confuse investigators. He'd return to his dumping sites, not just to relive his crimes, but to move remains, scattering bones to foil searches. "I'd make it hard for them," he later said, his voice laced with a perverse pride. He used the Green River's currents to his advantage, knowing the water would carry evidence away. When police began patrolling the SeaTac Strip more heavily, he shifted his hunting grounds to wooded areas near Enumclaw or abandoned lots by the airport, always adapting, always one step ahead. His low IQ, tested in the low 80s, belied a street-smart cunning that left the task force grasping at shadows. The climax came in 1989, when the task force thought they had him. A tip led them back to Ridgway after a witness reported seeing him with a missing girl, 15-year-old Deborah Estes. They searched his truck, his home, even his locker at Kenworth, but found nothing damning. Ridgway's calm demeanor disarmed them. He offered alibis, invited searches, and played the role of the baffled everyman. The polygraph, a tool the police relied on heavily, cleared him again, its needles unmoved by his lies. The task force's frustration boiled over. Reichert slammed his fist on his desk, vowing to catch the bastard who was making a mockery of their efforts. But without hard evidence, they had to let Ridgway walk, his secret safe for another decade. The resolution was a bitter pill. The killer was still free, and the bodies kept coming. As the 1990s dawned, The case grew colder, but the task force never gave up. They adopted new technologies, like early DNA profiling, and re-examined old evidence with a desperation born of failure. Ridgway, meanwhile, slowed his killings, sensing the net tightening. He blended back into his life, attending church, kissing his wife, and painting trucks, all while the ghosts of his victims lingered in the woods. The Green River remained a silent sentinel, its waters hiding secrets the police couldn't yet unlock. Seattle held its breath, waiting for the day the phantom would slip. The task force's pursuit was far from over, and the stage was set for a breakthrough that would change everything. The year was 2001, and Seattle's scars still bled from the terror of the Green River Killer. For nearly 2 decades, the city had lived under a shadow, its nights haunted by the ghosts of young women whose lives were snuffed out along the murky banks of the Green River. The SeaTac Strip, once a neon-lit artery of desperation, was quieter now, but the fear lingered like a lover's whisper in the dark. The Green River Task Force, battered but unyielding, had chased a phantom through years of dead ends, their resolve fueled by the faces of the lost: Wendy Lee Caulfield, Opal Mills, Marie Malvar, and dozens more. Gary Ridgway, the unassuming truck painter who blended into the drizzle of the Pacific Northwest, had danced just beyond their grasp, his secrets buried in the muddy earth. But the game was about to change. A single strand of DNA, a whisper from the past, was about to unravel the killer's mask, pulling Seattle into a climax that would both horrify and mesmerize. This is the story of a capture that shook the world, a confession that chilled the soul, and an outcome that left more questions than answers. The tension had been building for years, a slow burn that kept the city on edge. By the late 1990s, the Green River case had grown cold, the task force's budget slashed, their hopes dimmed. Detective Dave Reichert, now a seasoned warrior in the fight, refused to let the case die, his dreams haunted by the river's grim harvest. The breakthrough came quietly, almost seductively, in the form of science. DNA analysis, once a clumsy tool in the 1980s, had evolved into a razor-sharp weapon. In 2001, forensic scientists at the Washington State Crime Lab revisited evidence collected from the earliest victims: semen samples from Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Cynthia Hines, preserved like relics of a nightmare. Using polymerase chain reaction (PCR) technology, they extracted a profile that pointed to one man, Gary Leon Ridgway. The task force's pulse quickened. The ghost they chased for nearly 20 years had a name, a face, a life so ordinary it was almost obscene. On November 30th, 2001, the climax arrived with a knock on Ridgway's door. Detectives swarmed his modest Auburn home, their boots heavy on the porch where he'd once waved to neighbors. Ridgway, now 52, answered with the same bland smile that had disarmed suspicion for decades. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice soft, almost coy, as if he were flirting with fate. But the handcuffs snapped shut, and the mask began to slip. At the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he'd painted trucks for 30 years, co-workers were stunned. Gary, the quiet guy who read his Bible at lunch, a killer? His third wife, Judith Mawson, collapsed in disbelief, her memories of their newlywed bliss shattered. The arrest was a thunderclap, electrifying Seattle and beyond. Posts on X later buzzed with shock. The Green River Killer was just a regular guy? That's what makes it so terrifying. One user wrote, capturing the city's collective shiver. The interrogation room was where the true horror unfolded, a seductive unraveling of a monster's mind. Ridgway, cornered but calm, initially denied everything, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. But the DNA evidence was undeniable, a silent scream from the graves of his victims. Faced with the prospect of the death penalty, he made a chilling choice. He would confess, but only in exchange for his life. Over months, in a series of interviews that left detectives pale, Ridgway laid bare his gruesome legacy. "I killed so many, I lost count," he said, his voice flat, as if reciting a grocery list. He admitted to 49 murders, though he hinted at dozens more, his words a dark melody that both repulsed and fascinated. "I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many as I wanted without getting caught," he told investigators, his arrogance a cold blade twisting in their guts. He described each killing with a detached precision, strangling his victims with his hands or a ligature, dumping their bodies in the Green River's embrace, returning to defile them in acts of necrophilia that made even seasoned cops turn away. The confession was a crescendo of horror, each detail more grotesque than the last. Ridgway took detectives on macabre field trips, pointing out dumping sites in the dense woods of King County, along the Green River, and near the SeaTac Airport. He led them to the bones of 16-year-old Kimmy Pitzer, hidden in a ravine, and to the scattered remains of 20-year-old Marta Reeves, lost in the underbrush. He spoke of clusters, his term for the groups of bodies he'd left like trophies, his voice tinged with a perverse pride. "I like to drive by and think about them," he said, a smile flickering across his face that sent shivers through the room. The task force, led by Reichert, listened in stunned silence, their victory bittersweet. Each confession closed a case but opened a wound. The names of the dead, Gail Matthews, Deborah Estes, Carol, and Christensen, etched into their minds like a litany of grief. The resolution came on November 5, 2003, in a King County courtroom thick with tension. Ridgway, dressed in a plain suit, stood before Judge Richard Jones as families of the victims filled the gallery, their eyes burning with rage and sorrow. As part of a plea deal to avoid execution, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, the largest serial murder case in U.S. history. A 49th count was added later, bringing the official tally to 49, though Ridgway's boast suggested the true number was higher. "I'm sorry for killing all those young ladies," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, a hollow apology that rang false to those who'd lost everything. The judge sentenced him to life, without parole, one life sentence for each confirmed victim, plus an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. The gavel fell, and the courtroom exhaled, but the air was heavy with unresolved pain. Families wept, some shouting at Ridgway, their voices raw with anguish. "You're not a man, you're a monster," one mother cried, her words echoing the city's collective verdict. Yet, the outcome was not the neat resolution Seattle craved. Ridgway's confession left gaps, missing bodies, unnamed victims, and a chilling question: how many more? He claimed to have killed 70 or more, but some remains were never found, lost to the river's currents or the wilderness's embrace. The task force, now disbanded, had solved the case, but at a cost. Millions spent, lives shattered, and the city forever changed. Ridgway was caged in the Washington State Penitentiary, his days spent in a cell, but his shadow lingered. Posts on X reflected the unease. "He's locked up, but what about the ones they never found? That's what keeps me up at night." One user wrote, "The Green River, once a symbol of terror, flowed on, its waters whispering secrets yet to be uncovered." This was not the end, but a pause in a story too vast, too dark to be contained. What other truths did Ridgway bury in the forests of King County? Who were the women whose names were never spoken, whose bones still wait in the shadows? The Green River Killer's tale is far from over, and the next chapter promises revelations that will chill you to the core. To uncover what lies beyond the river's edge, to dive deeper into the mind of a monster and the city he haunted, follow our channel for the next installment. The truth is out there, waiting in the dark, and you won't want to miss what comes next.